Crowds leaned forward that day, expecting to see nothing more than failure. Yet what unfolded before their eyes left them stunned and silent. A man they had mocked carried knowledge that money could not buy and dignity that ridicule could not erase. And when the truth finally broke through, the balance between arrogance and justice shifted forever. What seemed like a simple confrontation became a turning point no one could forget. If this opening pulls you in, hit like, subscribe for more stories, and let us know in the comments which part of the plot moved you most and where you're watching from. Marcus stood his ground, though the stares pierced into him with the same contempt he had endured for years. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but his clothes told another story. Torn sleeves, shoes worn down to the fabric, and a plastic grocery bag holding all he owned. He was invisible in the city until he stepped too close, and then suddenly all eyes were on him, not with respect but suspicion. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low but dripping with disdain. "I said step back. Don't think for a second I won't have you dragged away." Marcus's gaze remained steady. "You don't have much time," he said, ignoring the insult. "That smoke isn't just random. It's from your cooling system. There's a micro fracture. I can fix it before it's too late." Ethan smirked. You're nothing but a beggar looking for attention. What could you possibly know about technology like this? The words hung in the air like poison, feeding the crowd's prejudice. A man in the back muttered, "Yeah, what's he doing near that car anyway? Probably trying to steal something." A woman pulled her child closer, whispering harshly, "Stay away from him." Marcus had heard it all before. He had lived it every single day. Being black and homeless meant he was guilty by appearance alone. Every step, every glance, every word was measured against assumptions that were carved deep into society. He wasn't just a man offering help. He was a target for ridicule, a symbol of everything people thought they had the right to dismiss. Yet beneath the grime and wear of his clothes, Marcus carried a knowledge most in that crowd could never dream of. He had once been one of the brightest engineers in the field of thermodynamics, a man whose equations and designs had saved lives in aerospace. He had degrees from MIT, patents under his name, and accolades that had once filled his shelves. But none of that mattered the day false accusations destroyed his reputation, when executives found it easier to discard the black engineer than confront the real failures inside their system. And so he fell, pushed by lies and prejudice into the shadows, where survival became a daily test. Marcus looked at Ethan's face, smooth, pale, confident, and recognized the same dismissal he had faced for years. He remembered job interviews where white managers smiled politely until they saw his address on a shelter intake form. He remembered the sting of hearing, "You're not a cultural fit." He remembered walking out of offices knowing he had been judged not on his mind, but on his skin. Now, standing before this white billionaire's broken car, he saw history repeating itself. The difference was that this time he refused to step back. "I know what I'm talking about," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the murmurs around him. "You've got less than 45 minutes before that engine locks up permanently. That smoke? It's blue-gray because the coolant is leaking into the tertiary chamber. If you don't fix it, you're finished." Ethan's expression flickered. How could this stranger know something so precise? But pride and the crowd kept him from admitting any doubt. He laughed harshly, turning toward the onlookers as if inviting them to share the joke. "Hear that? This man thinks he's some kind of engineer. Next he'll say he built the car himself." The laughter came quick and cruel. Some even clapped mockingly, while others hurled words meant to wound. "Go back to where you belong," one man shouted. "Don't embarrass yourself," another added, smirking. Marcus's chest tightened, but he didn't let the pain show. He had been mocked too many times to count. He remembered the day he lost his last job, the whispers in the hallway, the way colleagues avoided eye contact, the way management smiled while destroying his career. Those memories fueled him now, steadying his voice even as the insults rained down. "I'm not here to joke," Marcus said. "I'm here because I know that engine better than anyone else here, maybe even better than the team that built it. I can fix what your money can't." Ethan's face hardened. The arrogance of wealth met the quiet defiance of survival. and the tension grew thick. The billionaire had his pride, his reputation, his spotless image to maintain. Marcus had only his truth, and the truth was undeniable, even if no one wanted to hear it. The smoke thickened. Ethan glanced at it, then quickly looked back to the crowd, unwilling to show worry. But his eyes betrayed him, darting to Marcus for the briefest moment. Marcus caught it. He knew he had cracked the surface of Ethan's certainty. The venom in the phrase "people like that" was clear, and Marcus felt it sting not for the first time, but for the thousandth. His whole life had been shaped by those words, by doors that slammed shut before he even reached the threshold, by looks that told him he was already guilty before he could even speak. Ethan leaned against the car now, arms crossed, his polished shoes gleaming in contrast to Marcus's torn sneakers, and shook his head with mocking disbelief. "You've got some nerve," he said. "Do you really expect me to believe a man who lives on the streets knows anything about this car? I spent more on this vehicle than you'll ever see in a lifetime." His words carried not just dismissal, but contempt, a deliberate belittling meant to remind Marcus of his place, as if wealth was proof of superiority. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "It doesn't matter where I sleep at night. What matters is that I know what's happening under that hood. You can laugh, but every second you waste brings that engine closer to destruction." The crowd jeered again, one man shaking his head. Bold words from someone who probably hasn't touched real work in years. Another sneered, "Why don't you fix your own life first?" Their comments were daggers cloaked as jokes, each one reducing Marcus to nothing more than his skin and his poverty. He stood in the storm of their scorn, holding his dignity like a fragile shield, knowing that if he raised his voice in anger, if he pushed too hard, they would see only the stereotype they already believed. Ethan pushed off the car and stepped closer, his voice low so that only those nearest could hear, but sharp enough to cut deep. "I don't need a lecture from a failed man. You're standing in front of me with nothing, no job, no home, no proof of who you say you are. If you were worth anything, you wouldn't be here begging to touch my car. You'd be in a lab or an office, not on a street corner." Marcus met his eyes, the weight of years of prejudice behind his calm reply. "You're wrong. I've been in those labs. I've stood on those stages. I've filed patents with my name on them. But none of that mattered when a black man was easier to blame than the truth. You look at me and see nothing, but I've built things you can't even begin to understand." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the quiet conviction in Marcus's tone, but his pride refused to yield. He turned to the crowd and raised his voice. "See what I mean? He's full of stories, full of excuses. Next he'll tell you he invented the whole car himself. If he were really who he claims to be, why would he be living on the streets?" The crowd nodded in agreement, their bias confirmed by the simple image of Marcus's worn clothes and weathered face. To them, homelessness was proof of incompetence, blackness proof of inferiority, and his words nothing more than lies spun for attention. A young man in a crisp polo shirt muttered, "He probably just read something online and is trying to sound smart." Marcus heard it all, but instead of retreating, he took a step closer to the hypercar, ignoring the whispers, his gaze fixed on the smoke curling from the vents. His voice carried authority now, cutting through the noise. "The fracture is spreading. You've got less than 40 minutes before the entire cooling loop collapses. That's not theory. That's fact. I can see it in the smoke pattern, in the frequency of the engine's misfire. If you don't believe me, keep standing there and watch as your car destroys itself." For the first time, some of the onlookers hesitated. They glanced at the smoke, then at Ethan, unsure whether to laugh or worry. Ethan felt the shift too, and his expression hardened. He could not allow this homeless black man to claim authority over him in front of a crowd. Pride and prejudice blended in his veins, and his words came out sharp as steel. "Even if you were right, I wouldn't let you touch this car. You don't belong here. Understand that. You never will." Marcus absorbed the blow. His face calm though inside the familiar ache rose like a tide. He had been told he didn't belong in classrooms, in boardrooms, in conferences, and now here, on a filthy street with smoke rising from a machine he had once warned would fail. Belonging had never been given to him. He had fought for every inch, every acknowledgement, every chance to prove himself, only to be cast aside when it mattered most. Yet here he was, still standing, still refusing to bend. "Belonging isn't yours to give," he said softly. "The truth doesn't care where I sleep or what I wear. The truth is that your car is dying, and I am the only one here who can save it." Ethan's jaw tightened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he quickly masked it with a glare. He glanced again at the smoke, then at Marcus, then back at the crowd. "The fracture you're seeing is exactly what I warned about in that memo." The words cut through the noise like a blade, and Ethan froze. Memo XT447 was an internal aerotech document buried in confidential archives, never made public, never shared outside executive circles. The mention of it startled him, but he masked it quickly with a forced laugh. "Memo? What nonsense are you spouting? You expect me to believe a homeless man knows about classified documents?" His laughter spread like wildfire, fueling the crowd's jeers. But behind his polished facade, Ethan's mind raced. How could this man know? "XT447, Marcus repeated firmly, his eyes locked on Ethan's, unblinking, unwavering. "I wrote it 5 years ago. And today, your car is the proof that I was right." A ripple of silence coursed through the crowd. Even the most skeptical onlookers sensed that Marcus wasn't bluffing. His certainty, the weight of his tone, and the precision of his details unsettled the narrative Ethan had built to keep him small. For a moment, the laughter faltered, and some exchanged questioning glances. Ethan's pride flared. "Enough," he snapped. "You're just making things up to sound important. Anyone could guess something's wrong from the smoke." But Marcus did not back down. He stepped closer, his presence no longer tentative but commanding, his voice rising with an authority earned through years of knowledge, denied recognition. "That smoke is blue-gray because coolant from the secondary loop is leaking into the tertiary chamber. That's a direct consequence of the flawed alloy blend specified in the prototype stage. The engineers who took over after me ignored the stress warnings I flagged. You have 38 minutes left before the bearings seize completely. Tow it in this condition, and you'll cause even more damage. Keep running it, and you'll destroy the core. Either way, your $4 million investment becomes scrap." A gasp escaped from a woman in the crowd, and someone muttered, "How the hell does he know that?" The mockery began to crack, replaced with uneasy curiosity. Ethan's face betrayed a flicker of recognition, though he quickly masked it. He knew XT447 existed. He had seen references to it in closed meetings, warnings dismissed by white executives who claimed production could not afford delays. Marcus's words struck too close to the truth, but admitting it in front of this crowd meant giving power to the very man he wanted to crush. "You're lying," Ethan said sharply, but his voice lacked the conviction it carried before. Marcus ignored the insult. "I don't care if you believe me. Look at your diagnostics. They've already given you the 45-minute countdown. How much time is left now?" Ethan's hand twitched toward his watch. He wanted to check to confirm what Marcus had said, but the presence of dozens of cameras recording every movement held him back. To show doubt would be to surrender. Yet Marcus pressed on, relentless. "You know I'm right. You called the manufacturer, didn't you? They told you help won't arrive for hours. By then, your engine will be gone. You're running out of time, Caldwell, and your pride won't save you." The crowd murmured again, the tone shifting, no longer pure ridicule, but a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Ethan could feel the narrative slipping away from him. The homeless black man he had tried to reduce to nothing was standing taller, his words carrying the weight of undeniable truth. Ethan glanced at the smoke again, his polished image beginning to crack. Marcus seized the moment, his voice cutting through the thick air. "You want proof? Ask yourself this. How would I know the memo number? How would I know the chemical properties of the coolant? How would I know the exact failure rate of your bearings? You think I guessed? No. I know because I designed the system your car is based on. Every number in that engine, every line of code in its cooling protocols. I know them because they came from me." The silence deepened. Even the loudest hecklers fell quiet, their mocking smiles fading. Ethan's smirk faltered, his carefully crafted dominance shaken. He wanted to call Marcus a liar again, but the words caught in his throat. The detail was too sharp, too precise, too undeniable. Still, his pride fought back. "Even if what you say is true," Ethan snapped, "why would a man like you be out here on the streets? Why would a genius be sleeping under bridges? Tell me that." The cruelty of his question echoed in the air, and some in the crowd nodded, clinging to prejudice like a shield. Marcus stood firm, though the words stung with familiar venom. He had been asked versions of that question countless times, questions that weren't questions at all, but judgments disguised as curiosity. He drew a breath, his voice steady but filled with quiet fire. Because it's easier for them to discard a black man than to admit their own mistakes. Because one false accusation can erase years of brilliance when your skin looks like mine. Because the system is designed to keep me invisible once I fall. But none of that erases what I know. None of that erases the truth standing right in front of you. Ethan's jaw tightened and the crowd shifted again, unease spreading like cracks in concrete. A man near the front whispered, "What if he really did design it?" A woman murmured, "He sounds like he knows more than the company itself." The shift in the crowd's tone infuriated Ethan, but he could not deny what he had just heard. His calls had failed. The smoke worsened. His investors waited across the city, and his billion-dollar reputation balanced on a knife's edge. He was cornered by truth, and that truth wore the face of the man he had mocked. Still, Ethan tried to cling to control. He gestured to his security guards, who had been watching tensely. "Remove him," he ordered, but his voice cracked ever so slightly, betraying the storm inside him. Marcus didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stood tall, his words carrying into the hush of the moment. "You can have me dragged away, but your car will die before you make it to your meeting. And when it does, remember this moment. Remember the man you dismissed because he was black and poor, yet he held the knowledge you needed to survive." The crowd watched eagerly, some already smirking, anticipating the sight of Marcus being dragged away, reduced once again to the powerless image society had stamped upon him. "This gentleman was just leaving," Ethan said coldly, his voice regaining that crisp edge of command that had won boardrooms and silenced critics. The taller guard fixed Marcus with a hard stare, his hand hovering near his belt as though Marcus were some dangerous criminal instead of a man standing with nothing more threatening than knowledge. "Step away from the vehicle," the guard ordered, his tone sharp and dismissive. Marcus did not move. He knew this scene by heart, had lived versions of it countless times before, when he tried to use a library computer too long, when he lingered outside a cafe to read the discarded newspapers, when he simply walked down the wrong street. Security was always called, the judgment always swift, the outcome always humiliation. He inhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady, refusing to let the sting of degradation show. "You have less than 35 minutes before permanent failure," he said, ignoring the guard and speaking directly to Ethan. "Your diagnostics confirm it, don't they? And you know roadside assistance can't get here in time. You can push me away, but you can't change physics." The guard stepped closer, his shadow falling over Marcus. But even in that moment of intimidation, Marcus's words carried an authority that could not be erased by posture or uniform. Ethan glanced briefly at the smoke and then back at Marcus, a flicker of doubt betraying his mask of disdain, but he quickly forced it down. "You're harassing me," Ethan declared loudly, projecting his voice so the crowd could hear. "You're interfering with property you don't understand. My men will handle this." He turned to the security detail. "Escort him off the premises." The shorter guard moved to Marcus's side, his hand brushing against Marcus's arm with a casual assumption of dominance. Marcus stood tall, not resisting, but not retreating either, his calm defiance more dangerous to Ethan's pride than any physical struggle could be. The crowd buzzed with excitement, phones lifted higher, ready to capture the moment of disgrace. Another clip of a black man silenced and shoved aside for daring to stand in spaces deemed above him. Yet not everyone in the crowd was laughing now. A few eyes darted between Marcus and the car, noting how his words about timing and smoke aligned too closely with the visible reality. Still, prejudice ran deep, and most wanted the performance of removal to play out, to reaffirm their belief that the world was ordered as it should be. Wealth and whiteness on top, poverty and blackness beneath. "Wait," Ethan said suddenly, holding up a hand just as the guard tightened his grip. "Before you haul him off, I want to hear something. You mentioned Memo XT-447, didn't you? How do you know about that?" Marcus turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Ethan, his expression calm yet cutting. "Because I wrote it," he said simply, his voice carrying enough weight to silence even the jeers. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The guards faltered, exchanging uncertain glances. Ethan's smirk faltered for a heartbeat, though he quickly tried to twist it back into a sneer. "That's impossible," he snapped, but his voice cracked slightly. "You expect me to believe a man like you authored confidential documents?" Marcus's eyes did not waver. "My name is Marcus Reed. 5 years ago, I was the lead thermal engineer at Aerotech. I presented on the very stage where you once gave your keynote. I built the systems your car relies on. But false accusations stripped me of my career, and society stripped me of my dignity. Yet what I know cannot be erased by your disbelief." The crowd stirred uneasily, the narrative shifting in ways they hadn't expected. Even the security guards hesitated, their firm grip loosening. The taller one studied Marcus more closely now, recognition flickering, as though he had seen his face somewhere in a journal article or a corporate brochure years ago. Ethan's pride fought to regain control. "This is a stunt," he declared loudly, pointing at Marcus as though condemning him in a courtroom. "You're here to humiliate me, to draw attention, maybe even to sabotage my car on purpose." The accusation hit the air like a whip, and some in the crowd nodded, eager to believe it, eager to reduce Marcus once again to a threat rather than a savior. Marcus swallowed, the familiar bitterness of being labeled a criminal burning through him. How many times had his skin alone been evidence enough for suspicion? How many times had truth been silenced under the weight of assumptions? He knew Ethan's words were designed to destroy him again, to paint him as untrustworthy, dangerous, expendable. But he also knew something Ethan could not deny. The car itself told the truth, and every puff of smoke proved him right. He took a step forward despite the guard's looming presence, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Call it a stunt if you want, but the laws of thermodynamics don't lie. You can arrest me, drag me away, smear my name again, but your engine will still fail exactly as I said. You can deny me, but you cannot deny physics." For a moment, the crowd held its breath. The smoke hissed louder, and the car's diagnostic alarms beeped faintly, confirming Marcus's timeline. The evidence stood beside him, undeniable, though the prejudice of the onlookers fought to cover it. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, fury burning in his chest, not because Marcus was wrong, but because he was right. Because a black man he had mocked and humiliated now held the power to decide whether Ethan Caldwell's billion-dollar image collapsed in front of hundreds of recording phones. Pride roared in Ethan's veins, but behind it simmered fear. He could not admit it, not yet, not here. And so he forced another sneer, gesturing sharply to the guards again. "Remove him." Now, the guards stepped forward once more, but their hesitation was visible, their belief in Ethan's authority shaken by Marcus's impossible precision. And in that hesitation, a crack widened in the facade of certainty Ethan had wrapped around himself. Marcus stood tall, the embodiment of dignity under fire, his voice steady even as the crowd turned into a wave of judgment and scorn. The taller guard leaned subtly toward the shorter one, whispering, "XT-447, didn't that come up in a briefing last year?" The other nodded, uncertainty written all over his face. Their hesitation burned at Ethan's pride, and he felt the stares of the crowd pressing down on him, waiting to see if the billionaire would double down on arrogance or bend toward the truth unfolding before him. Ethan adjusted his tie with a sharp tug, desperate to project control, but his eyes betrayed him, darting back to Marcus with flashes of recognition. Somewhere in old industry articles or conference programs, he had seen the name Marcus Reed before. He remembered whispers of a young black engineer with multiple patents, once praised as the future of thermal systems, and then suddenly erased, replaced with rumors of failure and accusations of misconduct. You expect me to believe that you, standing here in rags, sleeping in shelters, are the same man who led engineering teams at Aerotech. Ethan scoffed, his voice raised louder now, trying to reclaim the narrative by leaning on the visible contrast between them. His suit against Marcus's torn clothes, his car against Marcus's grocery bag, his whiteness against Marcus's blackness. If you were who you claimed to be, you wouldn't be here begging to touch my car. You'd still be in a corner office or giving keynote speeches. You'd still matter. Marcus felt the sting of those words because they were the exact accusations the world had hurled at him over and over, reducing years of brilliance to a single question of appearance. He did not flinch this time. His gaze held steady, his voice calm but firm. You're right about one thing, I did matter. I built systems that saved lives in aerospace. I wrote patents that generated billions for corporations that now pretend I never existed. I stood on stages and gave lectures that shaped the next generation of engineers. And then, when a prototype failed because executives overrode safety protocols, I became the scapegoat. They plastered my name in reports, whispered lies about my competence, about my character, until no one would hire me. And when the truth finally came out, when I was cleared, the world had already moved on. My credentials were forgotten, my name tarnished, my life dismantled. You ask why I'm here? I'm here because this system is built to destroy men like me, to bury us under lies and prejudice, and to never let us climb back once we've been pushed down. The crowd stirred, some falling into uncomfortable silence, others whispering their disbelief. Yet his words carried a resonance that could not be dismissed. They weren't the cries of a liar reaching for attention, but the scars of a man who had lived the cruelty of prejudice and carried the weight of injustice. The shorter guard, who had once gripped Marcus's arm so confidently, loosened his stance and looked at Ethan with hesitation. "Sir," he said carefully, "if what he's saying is true, if he really is Marcus Reed, then we need to think carefully before we—" Ethan cut him off with a glare, unwilling to let even his own men doubt him in public. "Don't be fooled," he snapped. "This is all a performance, a desperate trick from someone who wasted his chance and now wants to steal mine." He turned to Marcus, raising his voice enough to reclaim the crowd's attention. "Tell me, if you're so brilliant, why didn't anyone save you? Why didn't your colleagues, your friends, your so-called supporters stand by you? Where are they now if you're really who you claim to be?" Marcus took a step forward, his presence towering in dignity even in rags. "Because the world doesn't stand by men who look like me when it's easier to erase them. Because when you're black and accused, people believe the worst without hesitation. They didn't save me because the system never intended to, but I don't need them here to prove my worth. The proof is in that engine. The proof is in your smoke. The proof is in the fact that you can't stop listening to me no matter how hard you try to dismiss me." The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing on Ethan's pride until cracks began to show. He opened his mouth to fire another insult, but before he could, the car's diagnostic alarm chimed again, louder this time, announcing 30 minutes to catastrophic failure. The timing was like an ally standing beside Marcus, undeniable, unshakable, and it ripped another layer of certainty away from Ethan. Phones recorded every second, eyes locked on the confrontation, the tension transforming from a mockery of Marcus to a quiet recognition that he might be exactly who he said he was. Ethan's mask faltered as he looked back at Marcus, searching for a lie, for a crack in the man's calm demeanor, but finding only steady conviction. And then, against his will, against his pride, he remembered the whispers at those industry events. The young engineer who had revolutionized cooling systems, the one who was erased in a scandal no one dared to investigate deeply, the one whose disappearance from the field left questions unanswered. Marcus Reed. His name had been almost forgotten, but it was there, lingering like a ghost. And now it stood before him in flesh and blood, humiliated by circumstance, but unbroken in knowledge. Ethan's jaw clenched, his pride still clawing for dominance, but doubt gnawed at him from within. He could not admit defeat, not in front of this crowd, not in front of those cameras. "Even if you are who you say you are," he said, his voice strained, "it changes nothing. You're still nothing now. you're still nobody." Marcus's eyes flashed, not with anger, but with a kind of sorrowful clarity. "If I'm nobody, then why are you still listening to me? Why are your guards hesitating? Why is your car proving every word I've spoken? You want me to be nobody, because that makes your world easier to believe in. But I am somebody, and I always was, no matter how hard you tried to erase me." He had spoken his truth and revealed who he was, the author of Memo XT 447, the forgotten black engineer erased from an industry too quick to scapegoat him. And for the first time, the crowd's jeers had faltered into silence. Ethan was cornered now, and he knew it, but pride does not yield easily, especially in front of a sea of phones recording every detail. He needed an escape, a way to reclaim control without bending to the authority of the man he had ridiculed. His hand tightened around his phone, and in a sudden flash of defiance, he scrolled through his contacts and pressed a name he knew could serve as either his salvation or his undoing. He turned away slightly as the call connected, his voice taking on the smooth tones he reserved for equals. "Dr. Eleanor Chong? This is Ethan Caldwell. I apologize for the sudden call, but I have a situation here you might be able to clarify." He glanced over at Marcus, his sneer sharpening as though daring him to be exposed. "There's a man here claiming to be Marcus Reed. Says he wrote Memo XT 447. Does that name mean anything to you?" The crowd leaned in, straining to catch the voice on the other end. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hiss of smoke, the faint whir of cameras recording, and then a crisp, authoritative female voice rang through the speaker, clear enough for all to hear. "Marcus Reed? Is he really there?" A ripple moved through the crowd, people gasping at the urgency in her tone. Marcus allowed the smallest of smiles to touch his lips, a quiet acknowledgement that truth always had a way of resurfacing no matter how long it had been buried. Ethan hesitated, his mouth tightening before he finally admitted, "Yes, he's standing right in front of me." The voice of Dr. Chong grew sharper, her words weighted with unmistakable conviction. "Ethan, if that's truly Marcus Reed, then listen to me very carefully. He is the most brilliant thermal engineer I have ever worked with. His research on cooling systems revolutionized aerospace design. Entire spacecraft rely on his patents. If he says he can fix something, you let him. In fact, I trust him over any team Aerotech has now. If he says your car has a flaw, believe it." Gasps broke from the crowd, the certainty in her voice tearing through prejudice like a blade. The guards froze where they stood, their eyes flicking back and forth between Ethan and Marcus, no longer sure of their orders. Even those who had mocked Marcus earlier now shifted uncomfortably, their expressions softening with reluctant respect. Ethan's pride cracked under the weight of Dr. Chang's words, his face paling as his hand clenched around the phone. He wanted to argue, wanted to deny, but the authority of her voice carried a finality he could not easily twist. He turned back toward Marcus, trying to keep his voice steady though it trembled, with barely concealed anger. "So you have one person willing to vouch for you. That doesn't change where you are, does it? You're still standing in rags on the street. You're still nothing now." Marcus stepped forward slowly, his shoulders squared, his voice calm but laced with fire. "It changes everything, Ethan. Because you know she's right. You know I was erased not because I lacked the talent, but because the system found it easier to destroy me than admit its mistakes. And now, in front of every witness here, you can't pretend I'm just a liar. The truth has spoken, and you can't silence it." The car's diagnostic alarm beeped again, announcing 25 minutes to catastrophic failure, as though punctuating Marcus's words with undeniable proof. Ethan glanced toward the hood, his facade of control slipping further, and in that moment the crowd saw the power shift. The man who had arrived in a $4.2 million car now looked smaller than the homeless black man who stood with unshaken dignity before him. Dr. Chang's voice broke through again, firmer now. "Ethan, listen to me. If Marcus says he can fix it, let him. He's not just knowledgeable. He's the man who designed the very system your car depends on. You can call your manufacturer, you can wait for your roadside team, but they won't arrive in time. Marcus is your only chance." Ethan's throat tightened. Every part of him screamed to reject her advice, to cling to his pride, but the logic was ironclad. His car was failing before the eyes of dozens of witnesses, his reputation unraveling with each puff of smoke, and the one man who could save him was the same man he had humiliated. His silence stretched long, the crowd waiting, phones recording, and Marcus stood motionless, his gaze steady, his patience unshaken, as though he had been waiting years for this exact confrontation. Finally, Ethan lowered the phone slowly, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if it might break. He waved the guards back with a sharp flick of his wrist, his voice cold but edged with reluctant admission. "Fine. Show me then. Show me this brilliance you claim to have." Marcus inclined his head once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, then turned his focus to the car, his voice calm and professional now. "I'll need basic tools, most of which are in your emergency kit, and 20 minutes without interference." Ethan's pride flared again, unable to resist one last jab. "If you fail, you'll pay for the damage." Marcus did not even glance at him. "If I fail, there won't be anything left to pay for." The crowd stirred, sensing that the balance had shifted, that the man in rags now commanded the scene with an authority Ethan could no longer deny. Even the guards stepped back with subtle deference, their posture no longer that of enforcers, but of men wary of interfering with someone greater than themselves. Marcus bent toward the car, his eyes narrowing as he studied the smoke, his mind already working through the sequence of steps, his memory recalling every detail of the system he had once designed and warned against. This was no longer about saving a machine. It was about reclaiming the dignity stolen from him, about proving in the most public way possible that brilliance cannot be erased by prejudice, that truth cannot be silenced forever. Marcus, standing tall despite the ragged clothes that still marked him in their eyes, approached the car with a steady calm that belonged to someone who knew his place in this moment, no matter what the world had taken from him before. "Bring me your emergency kit," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying authority that cut through the whispers. One of the guards hesitated before glancing at Ethan for approval. The billionaire's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod, and the guard opened the trunk, pulling out a sleek black case. Marcus took it with careful hands, opening it on the ground as though it were a surgeon's tray, scanning the tools quickly and efficiently. His movements revealed years of practiced skill, each gesture purposeful, his confidence radiating so strongly that even skeptics in the crowd began to falter. "This will do," Marcus murmured. He looked toward the shorter guard. "I'll need graphite pencils, Stettler Mars Lumograph, grade 8B. There's a convenience store across the street. Hurry." The guard blinked, clearly surprised at being given instructions by the man he had nearly arrested. But when Ethan, after a long moment, gave another reluctant nod, he hurried off. Marcus knelt beside the car, his hands moving with quiet precision as he removed a panel to expose the failing system. The smoke curled upward, the sound of hissing coolant punctuating the tense silence. Marcus pointed toward a faint residue pattern on the chamber walls. "There," he said, his voice steady. "The fracture is microscopic, but the coolant has begun leaking into the tertiary system. Left unchecked, it will destabilize the thrust bearings. You have 20 minutes before the damage becomes irreversible." Ethan crossed his arms, still trying to cling to skepticism. "And you think you can fix that here, on the street, with pencils?" Marcus's eyes did not leave the engine. "Not think. No." The guard returned breathless, clutching a small bag. Marcus took it, carefully opening one of the boxes of pencils, sliding out the graphite core and breaking it with practiced precision. He mixed the graphite dust with sealant from the emergency kit, creating a compound in a small container. The proprietary alloy in this chamber bonds with carbon-based composites under heat, Marcus explained as he worked, his tone turning almost professorial, as though delivering a lecture to a class. "By infusing the sealant with graphite at the correct density, I can create a temporary bond strong enough to hold until you get a proper repair. Improvised? Yes, but effective." The crowd leaned in closer, many of them bewildered, some scoffing under their breath, but less certain than before. Ethan muttered, "This is insane," but his words lacked conviction. He was watching too closely, his disbelief eroded by the precise rhythm of Marcus's movements. Marcus applied the mixture with a steady hand, his fingers moving with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, not in some corporate lab, but in the harshest crucible of all necessity. His eyes were sharp, scanning every detail of the engine, his mind recalling equations and tolerances he had once written into the very blueprints of this design. Time ticked by, the crowd silent except for the occasional murmur. The car's diagnostic alarm beeped again, announcing 15 minutes until catastrophic failure. Ethan flinched at the sound, his pride colliding with fear, and his eyes darted nervously between the screen and Marcus's hands. Marcus ignored him, his entire focus locked on the task. He vented the contaminated coolant, the iridescent fluid dripping into a makeshift container fashioned from part of the emergency kit. "That's nearly $20,000 worth of nano-coolant," Marcus said calmly. "We're saving about 60%. That should be enough to keep the system running." Ethan's brows furrowed. "You even know the cost?" "I helped design the coolant," Marcus replied simply. "I know everything about it." His voice carried no arrogance, only fact. He began applying the improvised sealant to the microfracture, his hand steady despite the weight of dozens of eyes on him. The silence was so thick that even the faint hiss of coolant seemed deafening. The crowd had stopped mocking now, their skepticism melting into awe. Here was a man they had dismissed as worthless, performing a feat the manufacturer had claimed impossible. The diagnostic alarm beeped again, 10 minutes to failure. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his breath shallow, his pride screaming for him to stop this display, but his fear for the car silenced it. He was watching the impossible unfold before him, and every second Marcus's hands worked was another blow to the prejudice he had clung to. "More light," Marcus said suddenly. Instantly 3 phones were raised, flashlights illuminating the engine bay. Their owners, who had mocked him before, now scrambled to help, eager to be part of the moment. Marcus leaned in deeper, sealing the fracture with surgical precision. His voice was calm as he explained, "The graphite bonds under heat. Once the system repressurizes, it will hold. You'll need to keep output under 70%, but it will last weeks." The alarm beeped again, 5 minutes. Marcus finished the final application, securing the panel with quick, efficient movements. "Start the engine," he said firmly. Ethan froze. "If it fails, it's already failing," Marcus interrupted, his eyes unflinching. "Start the engine." Ethan hesitated only a second longer before climbing into the driver's seat and pressing the ignition. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The crowd held its breath, every eye locked on the car. Then the engine roared to life, a high-pitched whine settling into a smooth, powerful purr. The smoke dissipated, the diagnostic screen flickered, and then displayed. System stabilizing, quantum thrust cooling functional. Performance limited to 70% capacity. The crowd erupted into cheers, a wave of sound rolling across the street. Phones shook as people captured the moment, their disbelief transforming into astonishment. Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing without words. The impossible had happened before his eyes, and it had been done not by his wealth, not by his connections, but by the man he had mocked as worthless. Marcus stood, wiping his hands calmly on a rag from the kit, his expression composed, his dignity shining brighter than any suit could provide. The crowd, once a chorus of jeers, now looked at him with awe and respect. Even the guards who had nearly dragged him away now stood silently, their posture shifted, their eyes carrying something closer to reverence. Ethan climbed out of the car slowly, his face pale, his pride shattered. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of fury, disbelief, and something else. Respect he could not bring himself to admit aloud. The screen displayed a stern reminder. Performance limited to 70% capacity. Service recommended within 3 weeks. For Marcus, it was proof of his genius, but for Ethan Caldwell, it was an indictment of his arrogance, because the very black man he had mocked and humiliated had accomplished in 20 minutes what his billions and his company connections could not. The crowd was no longer laughing or jeering. They were riveted, phones recording from every angle, capturing every detail of this reversal of power. Some whispered in awe, others shouted their cheers, but all knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Yet in the midst of a celebration, the car's diagnostic alarm chimed again, a low tone that reminded everyone the repair was temporary. Marcus turned back to Ethan, his voice calm but carrying the sharp weight of authority. "You're not out of danger yet. The fracture is sealed, but the system is still fragile. Push the car beyond 70%, and you'll undo everything I've just done. The manufacturer won't be able to help you in time, and you'll be left with a useless engine and a bill that would break even your pride." Ethan's lips pressed into a hard line, the truth of Marcus's words gnawing at him. But his pride demanded he resist the growing admiration that was building for this homeless black man. He looked around and saw the faces of strangers who had once laughed at Marcus now turning to him with respect, saw his own guard standing back in deference, saw the cameras pointed not at him, the billionaire in the expensive suit, but at Marcus Reed, the man he had nearly cast aside as worthless. The humiliation burned hotter than the smoke that had poured from the car only minutes earlier. "So it's temporary," Ethan said sharply, clinging to whatever fragments of superiority he could find. "You've bought me time, nothing more. If you really were as brilliant as you claim, you'd have built something that never failed." Marcus's gaze locked on him, steady and unflinching. "I did build something that never failed. It was your executives who chose to cut corners, who ignored the warnings, who decided my skin color made me easier to discard than to trust. Don't confuse your greed and your prejudice with my work. What I built was sound. What they did was sabotage. And now you're living with the consequences of a system that values profit over truth." The crowd murmured in agreement, their sympathy for Marcus deepening as his words sliced through the illusion of Ethan's untouchable image. Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he fought the realization that he was losing not just an argument, but control of the entire narrative. His empire thrived on perception, on the belief that Ethan Caldwell was always right, always in control. But here in the middle of the street, in front of dozens of witnesses, a black man in rags had unraveled that perception piece by piece. One of the guards stepped forward cautiously, his voice breaking the tension. "Sir, if I may," he said to Ethan, though his eyes flicked toward Marcus with respect. "The shelter confirms his story. He's been volunteering there, teaching kids engineering. They say he's a genius, that he's changed lives. This isn't some trick." Ethan's head snapped toward the guard, fury flashing in his eyes. But he could not ignore the way even his own men were shifting allegiance in subtle, dangerous ways. Marcus, unfazed, continued working, tightening a final bolt and securing the last panel before standing fully upright again. His voice rang clear, not boastful but resolute. "What you saw today wasn't luck, and it wasn't stunt. It was knowledge, skill, and truth. Things you tried to bury under money and arrogance. I saved your car, but more importantly, I proved something that no one in this crowd will ever forget, that genius does not wear a suit, and dignity cannot be erased by circumstance." The crowd erupted in cheers again, the noise swelling like a wave, their voices rising in support of Marcus, their recordings now turning him into a symbol far larger than the car he had repaired. Ethan's face reddened with humiliation, his pride collapsing under the weight of a truth he could no longer contain. He tried to speak, to reclaim some measure of authority, but the words caught in his throat, trapped between disbelief and fury. Marcus stepped closer to him, his presence commanding, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "You can deny me all you want, Caldwell, but the world just saw the truth with their own eyes. And once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. You mocked me, you called me nothing, you tried to erase me, but here I am, and here I'll stay, no matter how much it threatens your pride." Ethan glared at him, his hands trembling slightly, but he could not find a response. For the first time in his life, the billionaire had no defense, no clever words, no shield of wealth to protect him from the raw power of truth. Marcus turned back to the crowd, his voice rising now, not in anger, but in clarity. "This is not just about a car. This is about every door slammed in the face of someone judged by their skin instead of their mind. This is about every time brilliance was overlooked because it didn't come packaged in privilege. You all saw it, your laughter, your doubt, your prejudice. And you saw what happened when you were forced to face the truth. Remember this moment, because it says more about you than it does about me. The silence that followed was heavy with shame, the faces of the crowd reflecting the weight of his words. Even those who had shouted insults earlier now lowered their eyes, their phones still recording, but their voices stilled. Marcus had not just repaired a car. He had exposed a wound in the fabric of society, forcing everyone present to confront the prejudice they carried and the dignity they had denied him. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of the investors waiting for him, of the meeting that could decide the future of his empire. But for the first time, he hesitated to answer. Marcus, still in his worn shoes and weathered coat, had proven himself beyond doubt, and though the repair was temporary, the shift it caused in perception was permanent. Ethan opened his mouth as if to speak, perhaps to offer some weak dismissal, but nothing came out, his words trapped under the weight of humiliation. And Marcus seized the silence with the authority of a man who had earned it through years of struggle. "Your car is alive because of me," Marcus said steadily, his deep voice carrying across the street with quiet strength. But this was never about a machine. This was about respect, about dignity, about truth. "You mocked me because of my skin and my clothes, because you assumed genius cannot live in places like shelters, because you thought wealth makes you the only authority worth listening to. And yet here we stand, your pride shattered by the very man you tried to erase." The crowd stirred uneasily, some lowering their phones, others keeping them steady, but with new expressions etched on their faces, shame mingling with admiration, prejudice bending under the undeniable force of reality. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight, and finally managed to speak, his voice brittle and laced with resentment. "You've made your point. You saved the car. Now what? Do you want money? Do you want to humiliate me further?" Marcus shook his head slowly, his eyes steady. "I don't want your money. I don't need your pity. What I want is acknowledgement that I am more than the stereotypes you put on me, more than the lies that buried my career, more than the laughter of a crowd that thought they could define me by my skin and my circumstance. What I want is respect." His words cut through the silence like a blade, forcing even the most skeptical to confront the cruelty they had joined in only minutes earlier. A man in the crowd, who had earlier shouted for Marcus to leave, shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "He's right." A woman near the front, who had pulled her child away from Marcus in fear, now lowered her gaze, ashamed. Ethan, desperate to reclaim some measure of authority, forced a smirk. "Respect isn't given, Reed. It's earned. And you think one flashy performance changes everything?" Marcus's expression hardened, his calm now sharpened with fire. "Respect should be given to every human being, Caldwell. But if you want proof that I've earned it, look no further than your own engine. Look at the crowd around you. Look at your guards who hesitate to obey you because they see the truth in me. Respect isn't yours to grant, it's mine to command, and I've commanded it by doing what no one else could." The guards exchanged glances, and for the first time their posture subtly shifted, no longer poised to protect Ethan, but standing back in a quiet show of neutrality, their allegiance uncertain. Ethan felt it, felt the loss of control like a physical blow, and his pride burned hotter than the exhaust that still hissed faintly from the car. He clenched his fists, his voice rising sharply. "You think this changes anything? You'll still walk back to your shelter tonight. You'll still be a man with nothing." Marcus took a single step closer, his presence suddenly looming larger than Ethan's wealth could ever project. "You're wrong. I have everything that matters. I have knowledge you can't buy. I have dignity you can't take. And after today, I have the respect of every witness here who saw you dismiss me for the color of my skin and then watch me prove you wrong. That is more valuable than anything you could ever own." The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement, their voices rising in a way that was no longer mocking but supportive, a chorus that lifted Marcus higher even as Ethan's pride crumbled further. One man shouted, "He deserves more than respect. He deserves recognition." Another added, "Give him a chance, Caldwell. He's earned it." Phones flashed as the moment spread, the story already becoming larger than the street it unfolded on, destined to ripple through the city and beyond. Ethan's face reddened, his pride shredding under the weight of public opinion. And for the first time in his life, he realized wealth and power could not silence truth when truth was undeniable. His mouth opened, ready to lash out, but Marcus raised a hand, his voice calm yet commanding. "Save your words, Caldwell. This isn't about you anymore. This is about every man and woman who has been dismissed for the way they look, every mind overlooked because it came from the wrong neighborhood, every life broken because prejudice was easier than justice. You represent everything that tried to destroy me, but today I showed the world that you cannot bury brilliance forever. Today I took back what you tried to take from me." The silence that followed was profound, a silence filled with reflection and shame, as those who had laughed earlier realized they had participated in the same prejudice that Ethan embodied. Ethan's shoulders sagged, the weight of defeat pressing down on him, but still his pride clawed for a foothold. "And what do you expect me to do now?" he muttered bitterly. Marcus's gaze never wavered. "I expect you to learn, to understand that respect cannot be dictated by wealth, that dignity cannot be stripped away by arrogance, and that truth will always outlast lies. I don't need you to hand me anything, Caldwell. I've already taken what matters most, the respect of every soul who witnessed this moment." The crowd had become a living wall of witnesses, their cameras still recording, their voices now filled not with ridicule, but with a strange mixture of awe, guilt, and respect. Only minutes earlier, they had joined Ethan Caldwell in mocking a homeless black man for daring to speak with authority. Now those same voices were raised in reluctant admiration for Marcus Reed, who had turned a moment of humiliation into a triumph of truth. The hypercar idled smoothly behind them, a mechanical reminder that the impossible had been achieved. But the greater repair had not been to the car. It had been to Marcus's dignity, to the narrative that society had tried to crush beneath the weight of arrogance and prejudice. Ethan stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his pride shattered and bleeding beneath the eyes of every witness. For the first time in his carefully curated life, the billionaire was not the center of admiration. Instead, the eyes of the world, through the lenses of countless phones, were fixed on Marcus, the man Ethan had dismissed as nothing, the man who had risen in the very moment Ethan tried to erase him. Marcus looked at Ethan, his expression calm but unflinching, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had endured years of silence and was finally heard. "Respect cannot be bought, Caldwell. It cannot be stolen, and it cannot be denied forever. Today you learned that truth finds its way to the surface, no matter how deeply people try to bury it. You saw me in rags and thought you knew my worth. But worth isn't measured by clothes or cars or money. Worth is measured by what a man carries inside him, his knowledge, his resilience, his dignity. And those things you can never take from me." Ethan tried to reply, his lips parting as if to hurl another insult, but the words never came. The crowd was no longer on his side, no longer ready to echo his arrogance. They stood with Marcus now, their voices a low hum of agreement that grew louder with every passing second. A man in the back shouted, "Tell the truth, Caldwell." A woman near the front cried, "Apologize to him." And soon a chant rose from the crowd, awkward at first but gaining rhythm. "Respect him. Respect him." Ethan's face burned crimson as the voices pounded in his ears, each word a blow to the pride he had built his empire upon. He glanced at his guards, desperate for some show of loyalty, but even they avoided his gaze, their expressions neutral, their posture no longer projecting obedience, but quiet acknowledgement of the power Marcus now held. For Ethan, it was a nightmare, but for Marcus it was justice, not just for himself, but for every man or woman who had been silenced by prejudice. He did not smile, for this was not a victory of ego, but a restoration of truth. He raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent, the chant dying down as they leaned in to hear him speak. "I don't need an apology," Marcus said softly but firmly. "What I need is change. Not just from you, Caldwell, but from everyone here. Every one of you laughed when you saw me step forward. Every one of you assumed I was a liar, a thief, a man without worth, because of the color of my skin and the state of my clothes. You condemned me before I even spoke, and yet you watched as the truth unfolded, as I proved myself with the very knowledge you denied me. This moment is not just about me, it is about you. Ask yourselves how many others you have dismissed, how many voices you have silenced, how many brilliant minds you have ignored because they didn't look like what you expected. Ask yourselves what kind of world we are building if genius must fight through ridicule just to be heard. The silence that followed was heavy, and for once, no one dared laugh. Faces turned inward with shame, the weight of his words pressing down harder than any accusation could. Marcus turned back to Ethan, his eyes steady. You wanted to humiliate me, but in the end, you humiliated yourself. You tried to erase me, but instead you exposed yourself to the world. Remember this moment, Caldwell, because your car wasn't the only thing broken today. Your pride was. And unlike your car, no one can fix that but you. Ethan looked away, his pride collapsing under the force of truth he could not deny, his empire suddenly smaller in the shadow of the man he had mocked. The billionaire who had believed money could shield him from everything now stood exposed, not because of a machine, but because of a lesson he had been forced to learn in the most public way possible. Marcus turned back to the crowd, his voice rising once more, carrying the weight of finality. I am Marcus Reed. I was erased by prejudice, but I am still here. And I will continue to stand for truth, for respect, for every person who has been told they are nothing, when in fact they are everything. Remember what you saw today. Remember that worth is not on the surface. It lives within. And if you ever doubt that again, think of this day, think of this engine, and think of the man you mocked until he proved you wrong. The crowd erupted in cheers, not mocking this time, but genuine, their voices rising into the air as if to carry Marcus's words beyond that street, beyond the city, beyond the moment. Phones recorded, ensuring the story would spread, ensuring that Marcus Reed would no longer be invisible. For Marcus, the cheers were not the reward. The true reward was the knowledge that his dignity had been restored, that justice had found a voice in him, that the truth he had carried for so long in silence had finally broken through the walls of arrogance and prejudice. He stood tall in rags, but he was wealthier than any billionaire, for he carried something Ethan Caldwell could never buy: respect freely given by those who had once denied it. And as the hypercar purred behind him, a symbol of both failure and triumph, Marcus Reed walked away not as a homeless man mocked by society, but as a figure of resilience, a reminder that truth always prevails and that dignity, once reclaimed, can never be taken again at the end. If this story made you stop and think, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know what you felt about the plot. Was there a moment that hit you hardest? Was it when Marcus revealed who he really was? Or when the crowd finally shifted from mocking to respect? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from, because these stories connect people everywhere and your perspective matters.